But we're super excited to be here and be able to do this training for you all. Chris and I have done this training so much. We were sitting here saying, all right, I think we got this. We've done it enough times to feel comfortable with it. So we're going to get started, introduce ourselves and our organizations, and then we're going to do a small video just to give you guys a brief introduction to what labor trafficking is, and then we'll go more in depth on the laws and the nuances. And I think the most interesting part of our training is when we go into the case scenarios, because I think it makes all of the logistical things that we talk about in the beginning make sense when you're able to see it in a realistic case. So let's get started. International Rescue Committee has been doing this work for a very long time. It was established at the request of Albert Einstein, and in 2003 began doing work here in Miami, specifically when it came to human trafficking. Since 2003, IRC has served over 510 victims of human trafficking, and currently covers from Monroe County, so the Keys, up through Broward. And so we're able to provide services to all victims of human trafficking through the federal funds that we receive from the Office for Victims of Crime. Some of the services that they can provide include housing, case management, access to basic needs. There's a financial assistance component that allows for those needs to be met through the funds. And so it allows us to work in parallel with the survivor as they guide kind of what that service delivery will look like. And now, Chris.
Good afternoon, everybody. Just going to give a quick, update as to what DCF does. Most of the people here know them or to provide services as, child protective investigators or that sort of thing, but it's Medicaid and that kind of thing. But there are additional services like what Florencia was reading about with the Unaccompanied Refugee Minors Program, as well as there's a child maltreatment code. You guys might not think that that's a big issue, but based on an act that took place in Florida, when you call DCF, you can actually report a case as human trafficking. That's a big thing because before it wasn't being reported as such. So it's an important thing for you guys to know that. In addition, for foreign-born victims, which we'll get into here shortly, they're identified as refugees. And so they get those refugee benefits, which include Medicaid, food stamps, cash assistance, employment services, and that sort of thing. So that's part of what DCF does and some of the things that we help out with. So this is kind of a general overview as to what we're going to try to do in an hour. Normally, Carrie and I will do this for a long period of time, generally maybe 2 to 3 hours. So we really had to condense it, so bear with us if we're rushing through things. But we're going to go through the law because really to understand a lot of what human trafficking is, whether it's sex or labor trafficking, you really have to understand the law to see how it's being applied, right? So we'll go over that, some general statistics as to how it's being viewed throughout the world, and then case scenarios. To start it off, though, actually, one thing before we get moving, please interrupt us at any time if you have any questions. We really like to make this as interactive as possible because we want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So please just say, hey, Chris, Carrie, what's this about? So,
and I need the exercise, so I'll run.
Thanks. Okay, so we're going to start here with the video. That'll be a couple of minutes, and then we'll go on with the presentation.
I am a labor trafficking survivor. I came as a religious visa. So I was there for the leader. I was not given a salary. I was told to take care of their grandchildren. I was with them 24 hours. So I was sleeping in the same room with the children. I got out from this situation in 2003. And then I was scared to be undocumented. When I came to Tamayan, they treated you as a warm family.
Tamayan is an organization of Filipino migrant workers. The people that we serve work as nannies, elderly caregivers, house cleaners, personal assistance, and other work in private households.
Ito ho, mga karapatan ho ng mga domestic workers in New York.
We're really looking to reach workers who maybe have experienced trafficking or who are in the best position to meet trafficked workers. Labor trafficking is when one person holds or obtains another person in coerced or forced labor. It's the individual employer or trafficker who's forcing, coercing, manipulating a worker. So the indicators that we see are usually of threats, passport and other identification theft. It's usually restricted movement, restricted communication.
For a case of trafficking, what we're usually going to be looking for are signs that the workers don't have a freedom to move about. They aren't getting paid for the work that they're performing. Maybe they don't have identifying documents. They're being made to live in substandard living conditions. They may be skilled or unskilled laborers, young or old, male or female.
I never heard them complain. You know, it didn't cross my mind that they were being abused.
When you'd ask the boys, how's it going, then none of them ever said, well, this happened to me or this happened to me or whatever.
We had a case, and it involved the parent exploitation of American workers, and they were adults with intellectual disabilities. They were transported from Texas to a turkey processing plant in Iowa. For approximately 35 years, these adults were working for a company for at least 40 hours per week, but only being paid $65 a month. They were hidden away from much of the world. These men were punished in cruel ways, and so after 35 or 40 years of blood, sweat, and tears, when these men were finally rescued, they had nothing to show for it. What we find in a case like that, even involving people with intellectual disabilities, is that the things that make them vulnerable are the very same things that you might see in a case involving foreign workers.
The same type of force and coercion that a shackle would be is the same kind of mental anguish they're going through with some of the things that a trafficker might threaten them with.
In order to build any kind of relationship, you have to go out to them. I'm talking about everything from working with the social service providers, the clinics, the churches, anywhere where labor trafficking victims may go for strength or for help. That's where law enforcement should be reaching out and proving that we're serious about helping.
The Illinois Migrant Legal Assistance Project provides free legal services to migrant and seasonal farm workers. When we do specific outreach, we go to labor camps. Many times they have basic questions like, where is there a church that might have a service in Spanish? And those open up lines of communication where they come to trust us and talk with us. Usually by the second or third time, you'll get a sense of, are there some deeper issues here that are going on?
I think it all starts by being a good listener and letting them know that you are going to try to do whatever you can to help.
I met my trafficker back in my country, Dominican Republic. They offer us job in the United States, working in hotels. When we came here, what happened is there was not such a job like that. They got a job in DVD manufacturing company. We already invest a lot of money to come, so we had to accept the job, and we did. But he treated us like we were no one. We were living in a one-bedroom apartment, and it was 3 people living there. My paycheck every week was like $39. When we were in that situation, people could see us. We were hardworking in that company. Nobody noticed anything. And then we met Catholic charity person, and we explained her our situation. So she contacted one agents from ICE.
Ronnie had so many concerns. That was the biggest trust barrier to get over, to let him know that I am genuinely concerned for you and your friends and coworkers and for your families.
They made all possible to bring my wife and my 2 kids. I got a job thanks to the people that were out there to help me, but they changed our lives. I mean, they saved us. And I can tell you now because I'm a survivor of human trafficking, yeah.
Before we get started on all the technical things, and we're going to walk around, this thing behind this thing doesn't really work for us, so we're going to walk around. Are there any initial thoughts about the video? Anything shocking or anything that you all didn't know initially?
The people that got human traffic with these companies, did the companies get fined for it?
So I guess it depends on the case that you're talking about, right? But we'll use some examples later on that will show, like, for example, and we don't use this example, but I've used it in other presentations, for example, as to what happened with, say, phone companies like Apple or Samsung, and how that's impacted not only like fines in terms of a company, but also changing the laws at federal and state levels. So yeah, but like in these cases over here, I can't necessarily talk to about those specifically, but in the cases that we'll be presenting, I can elaborate a little more on that if you want.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Anyone else? All right, we'll get straight to it then. So this is the part that can seem a little, what's the word, Chris? Dry. Because we're going to be going through the law, but I think it's super important for us to understand how we got to this point where we can potentially criminalize against human trafficking and all types of human trafficking, and in this case, labor trafficking. So we're going to start on the different levels. We're going to talk about, on the international level, the Palermo Act of 2000. This was kind of the first time the conversation of human trafficking came into play. And its purpose was to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons. But it was initially focused primarily on women and children, but at least started the conversation, which then led to the national level taking some initiatives and putting it into law through the Victims of Trafficking Protection Act of 2000. And so that's what started to affect us here in the United States. And its focus was protection, prosecution, prevention, and partnership, right? And so we look into each of those sections and we say, how do we protect victims of human trafficking? And so that gave us efforts to be able to protect foreign national victims initially when it passed in 2000. And then we wanted to focus on how we would prosecute traffickers. So that leads to the question that was initially asked. And prevention, so things like this, going out and educating our community, doing outreach and training so that our community is aware of what human trafficking is so that we can prevent it, but also inform our communities of what to do if they they come across anyone that may be a victim of human trafficking. The interesting thing here is that this law was reauthorized 5 times. The dates are there: 2003, 2005, 2008, and 2013. So my question to you all, what does that mean? Why would there be updates to this law, so many since it was passed in 2000? Yes, ma'am. Oh, okay.
I'm thinking it's because of like the progression of the internet and like how I guess the ideas are spread throughout, and you have to modify the law to accommodate all different types of people, whether it's the LGBTQ community and and everyone, even men. So yeah, you had to update the law for that.
Yeah, I think you hit on some good points. I think that as we learned what human trafficking was in the context of what this law was written, as I mentioned, it was primarily focused on women and children on the international level. And then in 2000, here in the United States, it was primarily focused for foreign nationals. The idea was that we should have systems in place here within the United States to protect any domestic victim through any of the systems that we have, through food stamps, Medicaid, and Social Security. But quickly we learned that the needs and services for victims of human trafficking are so specialized that we needed to include all victims of human trafficking within the law, not just foreign nationals. And then we went on to include some of these focus areas as prevention and partnership into the law because we realized the benefit of including them. So locally, we, as Florencia mentioned, I'm the task force coordinator for the South Florida Human Trafficking Task Force. And that's a prime example of the partnership that we have here within our community, where we're bringing together law enforcement, community members, NGOs, and persons interested in combating human trafficking to come together and take those initiatives as a united front. So partnership, we realized that had a strong impact on combating human trafficking. Anything else you want to add, Chris?
Yeah, just one quick thing. In terms of the international level and why this is important, right? It was brought on by the United Nations. And just out of curiosity, how many of you guys would consider organ trafficking part of human trafficking? Just show of hands. Wow. Okay, so a great majority. In the United States, under the TVPA, that doesn't fall under human trafficking. The Palermo Protocol does include it, all right? So it's just important if you guys are going to be working some of these cases to understand how that would work and what that would be defined as. So just to keep that in mind, that the TVPA, even now that was reauthorized this year, does not include that term or that concept in place versus what the United Nations does include. So just wanted to add that.
And Chris, can you explain to them kind of what change did occur this year?
Oof. Well, okay. So generally speaking, like actually, and to give a little background, because what you were talking about in terms of learning about dynamics in human trafficking, it's very important. So for example, in 2005 was when they first included U.S. citizens, right? And then every year since then, in 2009, they included the fourth P partnership. Sorry if I'm talking too close to the mic. So yeah, so recently then they would be adding more of what you're talking about, the LGBTQ or more task forces throughout the United States in terms of making sure that there's a collaborative effort throughout the United States in working, whether it's law enforcement, nonprofits, and state-run agencies that are going to be providing services for them. So we kind of talked about this already.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
One thing that I do want to talk about this slide that we didn't mention is how many of you guys have heard of a T visa? You've heard it? Yeah? And you have as well? Would you mind elaborating on what that is, or do you not feel comfortable? No? Yeah.
Had an immigration talk last Tuesday, and
you did?
some came. So.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm glad you know. Okay, so basically what it is, it's a form of, it's a visa, of course, that is specifically for victims of human trafficking that are foreign-born that will give you benefits, and you can then adjust after 5 years and that sort of thing. But so basically, you'll get a work permit, and something that's very interesting that we get a lot about is if people will abuse that sort of visa, right? So the question is, and actually I get it quite a bit, is saying, hey, how can just, Carrie that's over here just go to an attorney and apply for this, right? So what I'll do is just provide them some data, which is each year what the TVPA says is that you can have up to 5,000 visas given out a year, okay? Up until recently, 19 years since the fact was taken, or since this was put into place, they just passed after 19 years the 5,000 cap. So, I mean, if we're saying that people are taking advantage of it, that's not the case, because you can see immediately that if 5,000 is per year, but it took you 19 years just to get to 5,000, that's not necessarily the case. So I just wanted to highlight that.
And that just goes to prove how difficult it is to prove these cases. And that's why not anyone can just come and want to apply or claim to be a victim of human trafficking. And the systems are in place to ensure that that victims of human trafficking get those benefits. But it is very challenging for various reasons. And we hear that all the time. 5,000, why not?
And do you both believe that those 5,000 could be, if there are properly find those cases, be established in that T visa program, like per year?
See, I think that one thing that you'll see is that, and a lot of the times there's a lot of issues with the data that's being used, how many cases are being presented, and that sort of stuff, right? But unfortunately, one thing that the U.S. government has set a standard for is it's a pretty rigorous process to make sure that you are a victim, and that they want to make sure that there's evidence for you to get that, right? So it's not necessarily something that there are these victims that aren't being identified. A lot of times there isn't a lot of evidence that will be able to back their case up, and unfortunately that's kind of where it ends, and they can't move forward with it. A lot of the times you'll see like these cases that we'll talk about further, that there isn't a lot for federal law enforcement or state law enforcement to go off of to say, yeah, this is a case, because as Carrie will talk about in terms of the law, you need to have certain things that will back it up, specifically when it comes to adult trafficking, whether it's sex or labor when it's adult, because we'll go into that here in a little bit, but you do need some evidence versus when they're a minor, sex trafficking.
Yeah, and to that point, some cases that might be identified, they may be victims of human trafficking but can't be prosecuted. Sometimes they'll be prosecuted under other crimes, so that way they can at least get some prosecution through. But it's so hard due to lack of evidence to be able to prosecute some of those cases as human trafficking. And the key thing that we should highlight with that question is that human trafficking is so underreported, and the data is still kind of evolving, and through the National Human Trafficking Hotline, we do get most of our data through there, but it's still something that we're trying to ensure that we perfect and we get accurate data when it comes to human trafficking.
And the last thing to add to what Carrie, do you mind if I just add something real quick? That normally the responsible thing to do is for the victim to be talking to an immigration attorney about what their best option is. So for example, what Carrie was saying is very true also, in that, say if the attorney says it's going to be better for you to go through a U visa, or if they're a minor and they'll go for the special immigrant juvenile visa. So depending on their case, like that data then might be skewed because of it, but depending on their case, it'll vary.
So my question is, typically how long will it take for the investigation to occur for them to receive the visa, or like how long, is there like a time frame to be like, oh, the time's up and we didn't have enough data? Or
statute of limitation? For reporting, you mean? Yeah. No, currently, it's my understanding there's not a statute of limitations for reporting human trafficking.
Not for TV, so no.
No, TV, so no. I'm like saying he's going to correct me. Yeah, no. So we've worked with cases at IRC that the trafficking may have happened years ago, and they're now at a place to be able to receive those services. And so as long as they meet the federal definition, which we'll go through, then we can identify them as a victim of human trafficking, then we can provide those services as long as it happened, within the United States. Yes.
Can I just add something? Sorry about that. I know. I'm adding. Well, no, just to fill in. If you guys do want to learn about a case that was before the TVPA even passed in 2000, it's a Cadena Sosa case that took place in Palm Beach, but that the ring was between, it's a sex trafficking case that's between Palm Beach and North Carolina. They would be moving the women, all that. And it's a case that I worked actually that basically what happened, and going to your question, I know you might think this is a random comment, but no. This is a case that took place in '98. I worked with them in 2006, and they were still able to get their T visa beyond that point because they were able to present their case. And actually, since there had been other victims in the past that can say, yeah, they were part of this case, it was stronger for them. And even if it was, over a decade after that case, they were still able to get the T visa.
So, what I was going to ask, you guys are probably going to wind up going over later, but I was just wondering if you would be able to give examples of what would be considered viable evidence to prove that someone is a trafficking victim versus evidence that we think might be viable but isn't technically viable in court.
Do you have anything in mind in terms of what you might consider?
I have, what I might consider viable?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Someone else's word, like another person who's in the same predicament.
I think we can go over that, yeah.
Yeah, I think in the cases that we're going to be going through, I think it'll give us space to be able to talk about the evidence, and we can assess it to see what may be, for example, labor exploitation versus labor trafficking, which sometimes can be, there's such a thin line between the two that sometimes they're mislabeled.
And you do bring up a huge point in terms of the difficulty of these cases, because a lot of the times it's hearsay, like kind of like he said this other person said that, and then whose word are you going to... And absolutely, and that's where the case a lot of times ends for law enforcement. You know, so it's a challenging thing, but when we talk about at the end, like what happens to these cases after, we'll explain to you kind of like what happens even if law enforcement can't provide assistance.
Yeah. So just even if law enforcement can't get involved, doesn't mean that they may not have access to the services as a survivor of human trafficking. But we'll go through all that on the back end. So what we have here are the definitions per the TVPA for sex trafficking and labor trafficking. So I understand that some of you are quite experts on sex trafficking in the room, right? Yeah, I heard. Yeah. But the reason why we put the definitions up together is because there are some nuances between the two definitions that I think when people focus primarily on sex trafficking, they may read over labor trafficking but don't also dissect it the same way. So we're going to go over a few key things on each one. So I'll read it. The recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act in which the commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or which the person induced to perform such act has not attained 18 years of age. What are the key things we're seeing from this definition, experts of sex trafficking? Force, fraud, and coercion. Okay.
What else?
A minor. So there's a specific language regarding minors in this definition. Okay. Who can tell me what commercial sex act is? Profit is involved. What type of profit? What would you define as profit? Cash. Different forms of funds. Okay. Drugs. So I always like to say it's anything of value, right? And so drugs have a value. Housing has a value. Clothing has a value. Food has a, and sometimes I think when we narrow it down to just being like food or clothing or housing, we sometimes will hear a case and they'll say, well, they took me in and they provided me warm sheets because it was cold outside, and they gave me a place to sleep. And so we sometimes get narrow-minded in how we define things of value, but it's important to know that it could be anything that has value. And I think when we put that in our mind, it opens us to understanding how sometimes some of these cases that may not initially look like human trafficking can be considered. Perfect. So let's go into labor trafficking, see if we understand it as well as we understand sex trafficking. So it starts the same. The recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. So what's the main difference we see here in between these two definitions? It does not involve commercial? Per the definition. Okay. It's broader? Okay. Labor. Okay. Doesn't have an age requirement.
Sex trafficking be labor trafficking?
So can a case be both sex and labor trafficking? Yes. Okay. Yes.
Is sex not included in the definition of labor trafficking because it might be legal in some countries?
No, the reality is the reason why it's split up, it's because of the age difference, I believe, that you mentioned. Yeah, it's because they want to, if you're a minor in sex, the case is completely viewed differently as anything else. So it's basically, when you're talking broad, absolutely, like, and we'll go over into that, but it's basically like it's a whole spectrum. It's sex, everything else. It's all just lumped together.
Yes. Yeah, prostitution is not legal in all places. Somebody else had their hand up? Yeah.
How do you define harder find? Well, did you want to take it here?
Well, I was going to say, I don't think it's necessarily on the severity of the crime. I think it leads to what Chris was trying to say earlier, that it's evidence, right, is what we need to be able to prove the case, usually through force, fraud, or coercion. And so being able to prove that for sex trafficking versus labor trafficking looks very different. And I think that part of the reasons why we come out and do these types of training is because our communities tend to know more about sex trafficking than they do about labor trafficking. So they wouldn't know how to be able to identify force, fraud, and coercion in those cases. But also collecting of the evidence, I think when we talk about agricultural cases, look very different than when we're talking about sex trafficking cases. So I think it's safe to say that it would be based on how they can build the case to be able to prosecute it.
Yeah, and just to add to what Carrie's saying, at least in the cases that I've worked, generally speaking, from the prosecution standpoint, it's not just the trafficking that they're going to be looking at. They're going to be trying to gather as many charges as possible. So when you're talking about years in jail, it really varies, like on cases. So that's what I would say to that as well, that it depends on other additional charges that the prosecution is trying to include in that case.
Any other comments?
Just one quick thing. This is a federal law, of course. I'm sure that you guys, or we already talked about it. How many of you guys think that there's a state law regarding trafficking? Think there is? Yeah? Not too sure? Okay. Some states? Okay. So does Florida? Yeah? Yeah? You think so? Yeah. Okay. So Florida does, right. And it's, yeah.
Sandy's like, you better say
yes. Florida does. And just one thing that I wanted to highlight here, and Carrie, sorry to take too long with this, is that for labor trafficking, you don't need to include coercion under the state law. And that's an important distinction versus sorry? Sorry?
For all, for minors.
For minors, sorry, yeah. So that's an important thing. If you guys are working cases in the future and have to understand this concept of force, fraud, and coercion, if you are working a labor trafficking case that's for a minor, you would not need to prove coercion. Sorry.
I think that's statute 787.06. If you were interested in looking that up. In Florida. In Florida. Yes.
Yeah.
Who can define force for us in layman's term? I keep looking on this side. Let's go over here. Who can define force for us in layman's term? Just make sure we're speaking the same language. Yes, ma'am.
Even if you do give consent or not give consent, the person can eventually change their mind as well, and they are forced into doing an act without choice. Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else?
You're talking about force, right? Example, I put a gun to your head. Hey, you better do what I'm doing or I'm going to kill you.
That works. That's okay. Fraud? Fraud? Florencia's working.
We need more mics.
Fraud could be like an immigrant being promised documentation, and if they do this work and not ever getting it.
So there was an agreement that didn't turn out to be the way that they thought it was going to be? Okay. And then coercion. Yes, ma'am.
She said she wanted exercise.
Yeah.
I had the definition in my head, but I'm pretty sure coercion is when essentially, like, if I were to coerce you into doing something, I would tell you, like, you have to do this because I have this value, and, like, I'm basically threatening you. Like, I'll report you to, like, immigration, let's say, like, and get you deported.
Right. So it's, you want me to take? Oh. So a lot of the times it's the mental control, right? The psychological control that somebody can have over you, certain threats, as you're saying. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So we've just been informed of time, so we're going to be very, this is what we're saying, we normally do this for 3 hours, but I understand, we'll shorten this. So these are the definitions of the types of labor trafficking that we saw in the TVPA definition. So I think that that's another nuance that we see between the two definitions. There's actually types of labor trafficking that they highlight within the definition, that with sex trafficking, it's kind of just a little bit broader in that sense. So I see a few you taking pictures, so feel free to do that. Are there any of these, peonage? Have you heard of peonage before? No?
Well, peonage is a very old term that was being used in terms of slavery and whatnot, and in terms of how they were controlled or how somebody was how do you say this? I guess indebted to somebody else. So I'm sorry.
No colonies.
Honestly, I don't know the origins of that term, but I do know. Oh, could be. Yep, absolutely. Yep.
Okay. Okay, we'll move forward for the sake of time. So under the TVPA, the one thing we wanted to highlight, as Kristen mentioned, survivors of human trafficking get access to benefits to the same extent as a refugee. And this is the letter that would be granted to them so that they can go and apply for these benefits. We have what's called the certification letter, which is for adults, and the eligibility letter, which is for minors. Honestly, it's the same letter. I think that they developed the two parts just for data collection and being able to know the difference between adults and minors that are receiving the letter. But this is the letter that would be provided to agencies such as IRC to be able to assist victims to go apply for those benefits. And it's intended to be kind of supplemental support until they're able to move forward with their T visas and eventually get access to a work permit to be able to work in the United States. So here we have the number of certification letters from between 2001 and 2017.
Through 2017.
Through 2017. And so we saw that 64% were female, 36 were male, and the average age of victims increased since 2001 from 29 to 37. So does the ratio to female to male, is that, and this is of all types of trafficking. The ratio from male to female, does that seem normal to you? Do we tend to see that females are more, like as a society, that females are more victims of human trafficking? Is that the case, do you think? No. And I think specifically for this training, labor trafficking cases tend to be group cases, and we tend to see that it tends to be groups of males. And Chris will go through some of the examples in a little bit, which we're trying to get to, because I think that that's going to be the key part of the training. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, just another thing that I wanted to, that we generally highlight or that we have the conversation on is first that, yeah, there's the both cases, that category there that isn't necessarily talked about quite a bit. And also just to see how the age range has changed from initially from 2001 to 37 nowadays. So it's something good to highlight. You guys have any questions about this? No? Okay. You guys have any questions? Okay. All right. Okay, so I'm sorry, you guys. I'm going to have to be really quick with a lot of this stuff. But these are additional laws that generally I try to highlight because they will impact if you guys are working any labor trafficking case or sex trafficking as well. So how many of you guys have heard of the Fair Labor Standards Act? Nobody? Really? Okay, well, just for you guys... 3 people? Just for you guys' general well-being, it's good to know because it really sets standards at a federal level as to how many hours you can work, the type of industries that you can work, and if you're a minor, well, when you can start working. Say, if I were to ask you, can a 15-year-old work under the federal law? Yes? Okay, are there limitations to when they can work? Yes? Okay, so all of that stuff, thank you, I didn't mean to call you out, but yeah. So it's important to know, like, if it really gets down into details as to school time, whether it's nighttime, whether it's they're on vacation, all that kind of stuff, and then it changes after that when they're 16, 17. And then, in addition to that, you also have to learn that there's specific segments, whether it's agriculture, like that kind of thing, that will allow you to work different types of or you will be allowed under law to work in that sort of thing. And so the Fair Labor Standards Act is what addresses a lot of that at the federal level. At the state level, another law that we include over here, they also talk about that, except for in the state, they also include agriculture and entertainment. Mm-hmm. That's something that's also very important to know. Sandy, I don't know if you talk about that in your class, but it's very important to see what you're allowed to do. So, for example, in that law, they also include, like, if you do commercials, like something in television, like all that kind of stuff, it's under that law, under entertainment. So it's important to know that as well. And I'll just be very concise with this as well, with other laws. So one thing that I wanted to highlight is that, the federal government tries to not only impact small cases or direct victim cases, but, for example, in the Customs and Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act in 2009, it's what the U.S. government is saying is that they can cut contracts off at specific times if they're working or subcontracting out with another company abroad that would be able to say, okay, these guys are involved in trafficking, we're going to stop that contract. It's important to know that the federal government is not only addressing victims directly with victim services, but also at a macro level to see what's going on with that. Again, I could kind of go on. Sorry? Oh, the Safe Harbor Act. Yeah, so one thing, Sandy, do you talk about the Safe Harbor Act? Yeah, okay. So since today we're talking a lot about labor trafficking, what if I were to have a male minor labor trafficking case, would the Safe Harbor Act be able to house one of my kids in one of these safe houses? You guys know this? Yes? Yes? Unfortunately, the answer currently is no. So there's gaps. And one thing that I'll be explaining in the cases, hopefully if I run through this, is that there are gaps in the law that can be and need to be addressed in a lot of these cases. Because right now, like I'm telling you guys, those male minor labor trafficking cases would not be included in that type of housing. So agencies like the International Rescue Committee or other people that have grants that need to find housing for these minors, or in this, also DCF, of course, would need to find proper housing for them. So that's just an additional point I wanted to add. So again, sorry if I'm running through this. Again, what's really important in terms of data, just for you guys to use proper data when you guys are talking about this, is, for example, generally speaking, what we try to look at is data that we feel comfortable with. So a lot of the times, they talk about how many cases are being worked and that sort of thing. What we generally go with is the Polaris project, okay? And how many of you guys have heard of Polaris? You guys have? Okay, perfect. So basically, one thing that we want to highlight, and actually, unfortunately, it already passed, but the task force brought a representative over here that talked about what they do. And a lot of the times, when you're talking about Florida being, within the top 3 states, and you guys hear that quite a bit, I'm sure. If you're talking trafficking, I hear that a lot. And a lot of times, at least Polaris can say, we are giving data based on calls, the calls that they're receiving, right? So in this case, for example, and I'm going to be jumping through a couple of things, but up until now, since Polaris started, there have been 7,800 labor trafficking calls, which aren't that, if you think about it, that's not a lot. That's not a lot of calls that are being made to the federal hotline to report trafficking, right? So in addition to that, though, that's one segment, is that the Department of Labor under the TVPA is able to report certain goods that are being exposed to either trafficking, child labor, and that sort of thing, right? So if you guys want to look at this, it's the tip report. If you guys want to Google it later, it's all free. You guys can look it up. It's really interesting if you guys just want to see what other countries are doing in terms of initiatives, what goods are also maybe related to trafficking. It's really interesting. So when we're talking about 148 goods in 78 countries, it's important to look at. So, okay, sorry, I'm brushing through this. One thing that we always like highlighting in all this, if you're looking at the list of the common venues or industries, what's something that calls out to your attention, something that Carrie and I already brought up? Anything in particular? Sorry? Agriculture? Okay. Why agriculture?
It came to mind because I saw like a documentary on it, but I know a lot of did.
Okay, so I'll get back to that point. Absolutely. One other thing that I do want to highlight, and actually let's get to the next slide just for time purposes. Okay, so what we're talking about here in terms of recruitment, or something that always calls out to my attention. So when I'm talking a labor case, because both Carrie and I have worked sex and labor cases, but when we're talking in this case, we're talking about the average age, and again, this is Polaris data, right? The average age for labor trafficking is 23. The youngest case that I've worked was a 7-year-old, and the oldest was a 63-year-old. So when you're talking about a range of cases that you can work, it's really very demanding, because you need to know a lot of resources that are in the community depending on their age and their need, right? So when you're talking, I believe you were talking about recruitment tactics, right? I think you were talking about recruitment tactics, right? You had one of the questions? Yeah, I think so. Evidence, right. So one thing, like for example, a case that I know that I worked from, a case in Peru, that what happened in that case is that they actually promoted it in a newspaper. And so they said I was fraudulently brought to the United States. They kept the cutout and they presented it in their case. So that is an extreme case that's great that they kept it, because not everybody will keep that. But that's something that will help. Most of the time when you're talking about hearsay, that's a lot of times with these labor cases. Unfortunately, you will have that. I will bring this up again in a little bit in the examples as to other evidence that you can present. But again, something that this is in the United States, the top 3 labor types of trafficking, and then sex and labor, again, both. Okay, so yeah, you can, yeah. So this is in Florida. One thing that you'll notice is that the top 3 labor trafficking are, the top 2, I guess, are switched off, right? So over here, agriculture, again, is number 1, and domestic is number 2. Another thing that we don't talk enough about in the United States are the traveling sales crews. Do you guys know about those? Yes. Sort of, yes, no, sort of. Okay. Well, a lot of the times, and unfortunately we didn't include it in this one, let alone with time. These include U.S. citizens. And a lot of the times when we're talking labor trafficking, a lot of the times we talk about foreign-born, foreign nationals that are brought here or that are undocumented. Right, but that is definitely not the case when you're talking about traveling sales crews, and you'll see that there was a case recently that was out in Orlando of minors, U.S. citizens that were fraudulently brought into that. So I encourage you guys to look into that as well, because again, it's something that not everybody talks enough about. And then again, when we're talking about the 3 types of sex and labor trafficking, you have the illicit massage, hotel and motel-based, and residence-based commercial sex. So do you guys have any questions about these 3 in particular for now? No? Okay, sounds good. Okay, so I'm going to be very, very quick with this example, but just so that you guys know. All right, I'll talk about, okay, the Global Horizon one, and what we're talking about, that case, the reason why I'm talking about it's the biggest case labor trafficking that the U.S. has seen up until now. It included 400 to 600 people, and it was based out of Hawaii, mainly West Coast cases. Or these were Filipino, okay, cases, and Thai. Sorry, Filipino and Thai, and they were brought to work in coffee farms. You know, do you guys know like Del Monte? You guys know that? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Like we're talking about major companies that were associated to this, right? And so what happened was that they were brought to United States, Hawaii, California, all the West Coast, and then they were exploited, right? To make a long story short, what's always important for you guys to understand is that even if it was in the West Coast, a lot of them ended up moving east. So for example, I worked with some of them down in the south part of South Florida to try to help them out and to try to help them acclimate to the United States. Very complicated cases because again, we're talking about them trying to establish themselves in different areas and having challenges being foreign-born and that didn't speak English in this case. And to be very specific or very quick with Fatana, that's a shrimp case. If you guys are interested, it's very, very important to learn about this as well, just because that's a case that Walmart was involved in, and nothing against Walmart, because listen, again, it's not nothing, huh?
You've shocked them. You've shocked them.
Well, yeah, I don't want to, but it's a lot of these times, these companies subcontract out services. And so this was shrimp related. So the shrimp that was being sold at Walmart. But again, unfortunately, if you don't have strong ties and know who you're subcontracting with, you can be involved without knowing in something like that. So even if you guys aren't going to stay working in the trafficking field, again, that's just a general recommendation to know that type of scenario that you can be involved in. What happened in that case?
Yeah, what happened to the workers? How are they trafficked?
Okay, like how they were brought.
What was the trafficking?
Oh, in that case, okay, sure. So what happened was that Fatana, that shrimp company, they would bring people over, exploit them on the boats and in the working area, and then they were honestly, unfortunately, since it's a global issue, the United States wasn't as involved and they couldn't be brought to justice in that case. But unfortunately, the only thing that can get involved is that Walmart can get either penalized or they're going to get the public display, I guess. But unfortunately, in terms of actual services that were provided, and that sort of thing. Nothing was really able to get done for them. And a lot of them ended up staying in Thailand and in the Philippines as well. Okay, actually, yeah, this is normally when we have more time, we kind of go over this, and there are these videos if you guys are interested in checking it out. But yeah, let's go straight to the Florida examples. Okay, so in these examples over here, one thing that I want to highlight that I was talking about before as well are gaps in the law, right? And what happens when you are trying to work a case and you're seeing that, wow, okay, this is something that shouldn't necessarily be taking place. So let's start first with the hospitality and tourism case. So, okay, this is a regulated industry, right? But how many of you guys know in cases that can be brought to the United States legally to work here that can be involved in this? Do you guys know about that? No? There's an H-2A visa, right? And a case that I'll just be very quick in this case, as well as is a case that took place in Destin, Florida. And what happened there is that they brought over European master's level students. We're talking like, I mean, again, it's a fascinating case because you're talking about people that can advocate for themselves, that should be able to understand what's right and what's wrong, and they were still involved in this sort of scenario. They were brought over to the United States to work in the hospitality industry, and ultimately they were being forced to work in something that they hadn't agreed to. But what the trick was, or at least what the trafficker was saying, is that they could have left at any time because they had a ticket back, right? But they didn't also talk about that, money was still going to be owed to them, and that ultimately the scenario wasn't right as to what was being sold to them, right? So ultimately, though, some of them decided to stay here because these were, they would say, okay, Carrie, come work for me for 2 months, and then you can go back home. That was the whole concept, right? That's at least how it was sold. So you have to be very careful with this sort of thing. Let me see if there's... Do you guys have any... Sorry.
The information is so important, and I don't want you guys to rush, so we can have 10, 15 minutes more. But I want to be mindful of everyone's time. If you guys got to go to class, I want to leave at 1:30. Just come through the back, and we'll sign for those that are medallion. We'll sign your sheets. Just come through the back. But if you guys don't mind, and if you don't mind, please stay another 10, 15 minutes.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Florencia. And I'll try to be quick. One thing that you need to understand about these H-2B visas is the fact that when you get this visa, you're tied to the employer. And what I'm talking about in terms of gaps is that, say, again, I'll use Carrie as an example. If I hire Carrie and I sponsor her to come to the United States, she can't just say, okay, I want to go and I'm going to work for Sandy because she offers me a better job. No, I still control her. And again, this is a visa-regulated issue that we're talking about, right? Because I applied for her to come to the United States, so I should be able to control her. Unfortunately, that gives me more of an option to exploit her because I can threaten her, say, no, you can't leave. You have to work for me and you have to do what I'm saying. See, so that's why it's something that's really important to keep in mind.
So use immigration as a...
Yeah, immigration status is something that they will use against them. Yeah, let's go. Okay, I just talked about this one. Whew, okay, this is more details about the specific case. Again, if you guys are interested in reading more about it, I do highly recommend, because there's a lot of details in here that will explain to you guys how this industry can get exploited, again, whether it's via subcontracting agencies or not. Oh, sure, okay.
That was a question.
Since you had, I think you had brought up the how much they owed and that sort of thing. Yeah, in this case, this is one of the few ones. See, as you're talking about, it's not just about trafficking, but they included smuggling and also visa fraud. This case, the traffickers really went out of their way to try to dupe the U.S. government. Some of them was sentenced to 41 months, and the defendants were liable for $1 million. Again, in this case, it really depended on what else was provided.
And the thing to highlight here, if you see the last bullet point, it says that human trafficking charges were not part of what they used for the prosecution, right? So you hear this and you would think automatically this is a human trafficking case. It should be one of the charges. But in this case, despite everything, it wasn't one of the charges that was against the individuals.
I will say, though, in this case, the victims that I worked with did get T visas.
Mm-hmm.
So even if the charges weren't brought in the prosecution, they were able to be granted that visa. Okay, domestic servitude. again, this is an unregulated industry. However, there are visas to bring people in. And there are cases actually of embassies and diplomats that are related to trafficking because of this visa or because they're able to bring people over. Not all the cases, of course. I'm just saying that there are some of those examples. And also an important thing that I try to highlight here in terms of protections is, for example, with the Civil Rights Act and the American Disabilities Act are excluded from protections for these individuals. So generally speaking, when you're talking about rights for employees, you would think that they would have these rights, right? But unfortunately, there are examples in which people are excluded, including domestic servitude. Let me see here. So I think I used an example here.
Oh.
Okay, just for the sake of time, do you guys prefer to hear an example about agriculture or domestic servitude? Both?
You said you go.
Oh, God,
And
all right.
I do want to say that each of these, go ahead.
You want to go? You want domestic servitude? Okay, so in this case, I think since I've worked the case, I won't read it, but you guys can get a general gist of it. But it's actually a school teacher, right? Maude Pollan, and I don't, have any of you guys heard of this case? No? The school teacher that was trafficking? No? Okay, so unfortunately what happened in this case was that it's a Haitian girl that was brought to the United States at 14, I believe it was. And she was actually at an adoption facility out in Haiti. And this adoption facility was run by the family of Maude Pollan that was the trafficker, right? And so she brought the girl over to the United States and was forced to work as a domestic servant. And she was forced to shower outside. She wasn't able to go to school. And treated as a second-class citizen. There are more details here. If you guys do want to read actually very specific or a very good article on this, it's in the Miami New Times. If you guys Google that, Miami New Times, domestic servitude, this an article that has all kinds of really interesting details about this case is great. So if you guys want to check it out. But one thing that you guys, or that's interesting as to when it became, or when it was identified as trafficking, was when Maude Pollan, quote unquote, lent out this minor over to somebody else so that they can profit from that. See, so they were saying, okay, I'm going to lend you, again, I'll use Carrie as an example, I'm going to lend you Carrie so that you guys can, so she can clean your house, and then, we'll call this off. So that's another aspect that you guys need to keep in mind. And unfortunately, that's one thing that I wanted to highlight as well, is that, and I'll talk about the mental health issues that come along with this. And I'm sure that, again, in Sandy's class, you guys talk a lot about trauma as to what happens with these victims. And unfortunately, when you're talking about sex and labor trafficking, you don't always talk about the psychological damage that can take place with labor trafficking cases. So in this girl, let me just give you guys a quick thing before I jump to the next case, is that she was 14, and then when I started working with her, she was 18, 19. And so what happens there also is that an expectation just in society in general is that they're going to be able to work, right? Because, they should, normally they'll be able to finish school between 18 and 19, so they should be able to start working. What do you do with somebody that didn't go to school after they were 14? They don't have the social skills to have interactions in terms of how are you supposed to dress for work? How are you supposed to talk to people at work? It's a very huge gap that when you're talking about just general life skills that you would assume that you have is a very, very, there's that gap, right? So if you are ever to work one of these cases, they're very challenging because, again, in this case, this was an 18, 19-year-old. The oldest case that I worked that was a domestic servant was 55, I believe it was. And one last thing that to talk about these cases is that a lot of the times they have issues charging the trafficker because of emotional attachments, right? So if you're talking about kids that are involved in these houses, right? A lot of the times, some of the cases that I worked, they didn't want to say, okay, so I'll use Carrie now as the trafficker. Carrie, you're the trafficker, but Carrie has kids, and I don't want to take her as their parents or as her mom away from them, right? So a lot of the times, what do you do then? Because, again, this 55-year-old, she had worked more than, I believe, 11 or 12 years with that family. And so how do you let go of that? And then also, what are your expectations in terms of work? Sorry, I know. Sorry.
No, all I was going to say that I think an interesting part of this case that we haven't touched on due to time is the cultural aspect. And so it's mentioned here in the bullet, and I would highly recommend you read the case as Chris has suggested, but how many of you are aware of what Restavik means? Okay. And so the Restavik in the Haitian community is actually not a negative thing. However, when the cases are taken into this form and then they're exploited once they arrive, so there's that thin line between respecting culture, like cultural norms, and when exploitation gets involved, and now we have a potential victim of human trafficking. And I think that one of the things that when we work with these cases, understanding the culture that they come from, and understanding how that may make it difficult for them to want to, prosecute or charge the trafficker when, despite all that, may be the person that helped them, that brought them to this country, that may have given them support, going the next step and prosecuting them against a crime, it's understandable why there may be some difficulty.
Question regarding the girl. Assuming that she was not allowed to have an education, would that include like literacy skills and language barrier? So she wouldn't be able to communicate with other people in English if you said she didn't have the social skills as well, right? So language is included. And she only spoke Creole or French. That's interesting.
So that's part of the control, right?
Right. You can't speak in the language of the locals and you can't say what's going on.
Now, fortunately, we were able to get Creole-speaking an immigration attorney. Oh, yeah, absolutely. No, and when you're talking about, fortunately, in South Florida, you do have a community that can support, the Haitian victims. And again, we're going to go into agriculture in a little bit, but there was a case of, I believe, over 25 victims that were supposed to work in agriculture that were Haitian, that didn't speak English either, that were very vulnerable, that were brought to the United States as well. And there you also have that language component, that social issue. But with her, it was really heartbreaking. I'm not going to lie, just because, you want to be there just to walk her through, like, even just an interview. And so when you do take her to an interview and you try to coach her, say this, say that, but then that they're going to be freaking out at that. And listen, getting a job already is hard. Can you imagine somebody that doesn't really know what to do with that sense?
Stockholm syndrome, as well as like there's the case of the Austrian man who kept his daughter like trapped in a like a cellar, and they were like away from society for like 18 or 20 years. So in a way, like I'm trying to connect it, like they can't really they can't communicate. They don't have social skills. Like they can't talk to people. They're scared of others. Yeah, like
I was gonna say the other challenge, not only with the social skills and being able to go into interviews and working in a work environment, we often see that those victims that may have been subjected to domestic servitude for most of their life, when we sit down and we are having the conversation as to what is going to be the next form of employment, where would they apply, their expertise and their skills is associated to what they were trafficked in. And so understanding kind of the nuances, and that's where education comes in and informing them of the rights that they have within the United States, because it's respecting their choice, that might be the sector that they may want to go into, but making sure that we educate them and advise them of the rights that they have.
Just to wrap this one up on this section. Oh, sorry, I know we have to go to this.
Chris, I was going to ask you something. Can you quickly go into how the labor and sex trafficking are connected to each other? I know domestic servitude is probably one of the biggest examples of how it's both.
Thanks, Sandy. That's exactly what I was going to bring up. No, because there's a case that that I worked in Immokalee also that's very heartbreaking as well, that you're talking about minors in which the father then not only was doing the domestic or forcing her to work that, but then he started exploiting her as well with sex trafficking. And there, the isolation factor was huge in this case. That and he was married, and his wife also still allowed this to take place, in which the domestic servant was still being abused sexually and being forced into that situation. Unfortunately, again, like I'm using this term isolated, it's very true, because it's very, very hard to identify these cases and to get them help, And sorry, I know you're looking at me with that face. All right.
No, I'm just trying to figure
That time. Okay. All right. Agriculture. So in this case, again, you can come to the United States here legally to work in the agricultural fields, right? And for that, this was the H-2A visas, okay? And so what I try to highlight in that sense is that it's not all just undocumented. There are U.S. citizens that are working in the fields, and that that you can work here and come to the United States legally to work this. So let's go to this next slide over here. So, okay, I just wanted to break down really quickly agriculture in Florida. You were mentioning agriculture, I believe. So it's very difficult because Florida is very, very big in this sort of industry, right? So what I talked about over here is that you have fruits that include Asian pear, avocados, bananas, blackberries, mangoes, grapes, papayas, passion fruit, peaches, etc. Okay? And so here, let's put this next one. So these are right over here, as you can see in the map, that the grapes explain what, or the major farm areas that are specific to fruits, okay? And what we're trying to highlight here with Carrie is that this is, oh, okay, the next one. And this is vegetables. So here, let's do the whole map. Vegetables, citrus, and field crops, okay? So what I'm trying to highlight in this case is that you can find methods of exploitation in agriculture in various industries, whether it's fruits, vegetables, field crops, or just general citrus. So again, it's something that Florida is really exposed to this sort of thing, and it's really easily, readily made available. So sorry, you know. Okay, so what happens when these cases are found? Okay, so in terms of general services, I don't know if Carrie, you wanted to jump in on this one, or okay, yeah, let's go to this next slide actually, just for a second. Yeah, for the expectations.
So I think this touches on a few things that we brought up while we were talking about the cases. Expectations, as I mentioned, there are cultural differences, and so understanding the cultural background of the victim in relation to who they may be receiving services from. And so understanding, and we see this a lot with the unaccompanied minor victims that we work with, that their focus or their goal is to come into the United States and work, right, to provide for their families back home. So it's understanding that while also educating them about what the laws are here in the United States. And that's why Chris was highlighting the different federal laws that we have. We get called in all the time for staffings, and they're saying, well, there's this unaccompanied minor working in the fields. And when we assess it based off the law, it's not trafficking. They can work per the amount of hours, and if it's agriculture and whatever sector that they're working in. Languages, as we had mentioned, we work with translators and interpreters to ensure that they have access for us to fully understand each other in the delivery of service. Because there's nuances in words that may be in one culture to another, and even in Spanish, right? There are words that may mean something to one culture that mean something completely different for another. So not making the assumption that we automatically speak the same language. And when you work with indigenous groups, such as the victims that we work with from Guatemala that have over 30-something dialects, and each of those dialects are unique and different. So making sure that you have the appropriate services available to ensure that they get full access to the services that they need. We talked about the challenges that may come with employment after being a victim of labor trafficking, such as the example for domestic servitude. If that's the skill set that they have, what are the options for them moving forward? And being able to, again, educate them on the rights that they have if that's what they choose to continue to work in. Through the T visa, it does allow, so if they're able to obtain a T visa, they're allowed to bring families, and it breaks it down to what they call derivatives, and they can bring their family over from home country if there are certain criteria that they meet, if you want to.
Yeah, just one thing to highlight. The T visa can be for sex and labor trafficking, right? So it's important to note that, like, what we're highlighting is yeah, it's for foreign born, but it can fall for both cases. And yeah, it's, again, when you're talking about exploiting that sort of service, it's very hard to still bring them because you still need to prove that safety is, their family members are in danger. I believe, did you have a question? Sorry.
Regarding the visas, do you recommend them applying for both the T visa and the U visa, or just one or the other?
I would recommend you talk to an immigration attorney, honestly. In all frankness, I know about the T visa and I know how it works. I've seen people that get it and I see the benefits, all that stuff. I've read the law. That's great. I don't like to give any kind of recommendations. It's always depending on the case. That's what attorneys always tell me. and whether it's the U visa, because U visa includes all different types of crimes, right? It's not just trafficking.
Youth assault.
Yeah, exactly, right. Domestic violence. There's all kinds of different things. So if you do know of a case or something like that, I would definitely recommend them talking to an immigration attorney to see what would be their best avenue depending on their case. So, and each case is so unique.
So we know that 90% of you have to leave at 1:45 in 1 minute. So we will
wrap it up here. Wow. Okay, Sandy, you've talked about mental health issues with sex trafficking. Okay, so here, can you go back to the mental health one? I'll close off on this one. Okay, so what are some of the issues or mental health issues that you guys see with sex trafficking? PTSD? Okay, what else? Trauma bonds? Okay, what else? Substance abuse.
I'll just repeat because.
Okay, yeah, sure. Depression for long term. Okay. Psychosis from drugs. Okay, perfect. Okay. Anything else? No. If you're looking at this list over here, do you guys see anything that's very different in the psychological impact in particular? Right? So one thing that I'm trying to highlight here is that labor trafficking cases as well as sex trafficking cases can be impacted and have different types of trauma, right? So we're talking about PTSD, feeling of guilt and shame, and I'm telling you guys, these are all very real. When you're talking about substance abuse or, what was yours again? Psychosis. Absolutely. All of that is very real also in labor trafficking. So when you guys are going to be thinking about this, think that the trauma can happen in both of these types of cases. And I know we'll be wrapping this up. Carrie, is there anything that you'd wanted to add before we wrap it up? No?
No, so these are, please take a picture of this screen if you'd like to. This is access to additional information and also additional to whatever we mentioned while we were here. We appreciate you guys taking the time. We know that you are staying longer than you should, and we appreciate that. But this is such an intense topic that we find ourselves always, like I said, we normally would do this in 3 hours, so we appreciate your time. Thank you.
We'll bring you back for the 3 hours. Thank you so much. And I'm pretty sure if you guys have questions, please make sure to get our contact. Email me the questions. I make